What happens when a man refuses to be intimidated by a cop abusing his power? Today's story dives deep into a tense encounter between Officer Rick Jarvis, a veteran cop with a reputation for arrogance, and Brian Bauer, a hardworking man who stood his ground in the face of injustice. In a quiet town like Riverdale, Officer Rick had grown used to throwing his weight around, treating people as if they were beneath him. But one late afternoon, when he decided to target Brian, a man he assumed was up to no good, he met his match. This is a story about prejudice, abuse of power, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Stay till the end to see how one man's calm but firm resistance forced an arrogant officer to confront his own actions. Officer Rick Jarvis had been a fixture on the streets of Riverdale for over a decade. He knew every corner, every alley, and every shortcut in the quiet town he patrolled. But while his years of service gave him a deep familiarity with the area, they also earned him a reputation, one that wasn't exactly flattering. Rick was known for his quick temper and for looking down on anyone he deemed trouble. To him, respect was something he demanded but rarely gave, especially to those he believed didn't belong in his version of Riverdale. Riverdale itself was the kind of place where people kept to themselves. It was peaceful on the surface, a small town where life moved at a slower pace, and authority often went unquestioned. Most residents were hesitant to challenge figures like Rick, a man who carried himself with an air of unshakable power. But one late afternoon, Rick's routine patrol took an unexpected turn. At a traffic light, he spotted an ash-gray pickup truck, its size and presence catching his attention. Behind the wheel sat a man whose rugged appearance immediately triggered Rick's assumptions. Without a second thought, Rick decided to investigate. Flipping on his flashing lights, he tailed the truck, already formulating a narrative about the driver before the interaction even began. To Rick, this was just another moment to assert his authority, another chance to remind someone who was really in charge. Behind the wheel of the ash-gray pickup truck sat Brian Bauer, a man who immediately stood out. Towering at over 6 feet tall and built like a tank, Brian's sheer presence was commanding. But it wasn't just his size that made an impression. It was his calm, no-nonsense demeanor. Brian was the type of man who didn't go looking for trouble, but certainly wasn't about to back down from it either. He had worked hard to build an honest life, and he wasn't one to take kindly to unwarranted harassment. As Officer Rick Jarvis approached the truck, flashlight in hand and a smirk on his face, Brian stayed still, watching him with an expression that was calm, yet unyielding. Rick knocked on the window with exaggerated force, signaling for Brian to roll it down. Slowly, Brian complied, his steely gaze meeting Rick's. The tension was palpable, but Brian remained composed. "License and registration," Rick barked, his tone laced with authority and disdain. Brian reached into his glove compartment and handed over his documents without a word. Rick glanced at the name on the license and scoffed. "Brian, huh?" he muttered, as if the name alone was enough to fuel his assumptions. Rick leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his question more of an accusation than genuine curiosity. "Work," Brian replied curtly, his voice steady. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially not with someone clearly looking for a fight. But Rick wasn't satisfied with Brian's short answers. "Work, huh?" he sneered, tapping the side of the truck with his flashlight. "Seems like a big truck for someone who just works. You sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be?" Brian's face remained calm, though his eyes never left Rick's. He wasn't rattled. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, and wasn't about to let Rick's taunts get under his skin. But Rick, mistaking Brian's silence for defiance, pushed harder, trying to provoke him. Through it all, Brian stayed firm, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Rick's aggressive tone. It was clear that Brian wasn't intimidated. He was simply choosing not to stoop to Rick's level. Yet the tension between them was rising, and it was only a matter of time before things reached a boiling point. The situation took a sharp turn as Rick, growing impatient with Brian's calm defiance, decided to escalate. "Step out of the vehicle," Rick ordered, his voice loud and challenging. Without a word, Brian opened the door and stepped out. As he stood tall, towering over Rick, the power dynamic shifted instantly. For the first time, Rick got a full sense of Brian's sheer size. A giant of a man with solid muscle and an unyielding presence. But Rick, unwilling to back down, pushed forward, determined to assert his authority despite the obvious disadvantage. Rick's smirk returned as he poked Brian in the chest with his flashlight. "Think you're tough, huh?" he taunted, his tone dripping with arrogance. Brian took a small step back, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "You should back off, officer," Brian said, his voice low and controlled. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Rick didn't listen. He kept prodding, his words growing more cutting as he tried to provoke a reaction. Finally, as Rick leaned closer, his finger nearly in Brian's face, Brian had enough. In one swift motion, he grabbed Rick's arm, his grip like steel. The sudden move caught Rick off guard, and his confidence faltered for the first time. "Listen here, officer," Brian said, his tone steady but firm. "I don't want trouble, but if you keep pushing, you'll get what you're asking for." His words hung heavy in the air, a warning Rick couldn't ignore. For a moment they stood locked in a tense standoff, the weight of the situation thick in the air. Rick's hand twitched toward his radio, debating whether to call for backup, but Brian's unflinching gaze stopped him. The crowd that had begun to gather nearby whispered and pointed, their attention now on Rick's every move. The pressure was mounting, and Rick found himself questioning whether he was truly in control. As the tension reached its peak, Brian's voice cut through the charged air like a knife. His tone was calm but firm, each word deliberate. "Power doesn't make you right," he said, his steely gaze fixed on Rick. "Respect is a two-way street." The words struck a chord, carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, Rick felt a flicker of doubt. He had spent years using his badge as a tool to assert dominance. But now, faced with a man who refused to be intimidated, he was forced to confront the cracks in his authority. Rick glanced around and noticed the growing crowd. Shopkeepers and pedestrians had stopped to watch, their whispers growing louder with every passing second. He could feel their eyes on him, judging his every move. For a man who thrived on control, the realization that his reputation was on the line was jarring. The power he had always wielded so effortlessly suddenly felt fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. Taking a step back, Rick's demeanor shifted. The cocky arrogance he had displayed moments ago gave way to a more subdued tone. He cleared his throat and muttered, "Maybe we both got off on the wrong foot. Let's move on from this." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was as close as Rick could bring himself to admitting fault. Brian stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped back toward his truck, maintaining his calm composure. He climbed in without another word, started the engine, and drove off, leaving Rick standing there, feeling the weight of his own actions. The crowd began to disperse, but the lesson Rick had been forced to confront lingered, leaving him to reflect on the man he had become and the power he had misused. Brian started his truck, his movements calm and deliberate, as if to show the world that he wasn't rattled by the encounter. Without so much as a glance back at Rick, he drove off, his head held high. In that moment, Brian's quiet strength spoke louder than words ever could. He had stood his ground, maintained his dignity, and reminded everyone watching that true courage doesn't come from aggression, but from self-respect and composure. Rick stood motionless, watching the truck disappear down the road. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the weight of their judgment lingered in the air. For the first time in his career, Rick felt a pang of something unfamiliar: regret. He had always been quick to act, quick to judge, and quicker still to assert his authority. But this encounter forced him to confront the consequences of his actions. The calm defiance in Brian's eyes, the crowd's silent disapproval, and his own growing awareness of his flaws all converged in his mind. That day, something shifted in Rick. He wasn't sure if he could change overnight, but he knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. Brian, meanwhile, became a legend in Riverdale. People spoke of the man who stood tall against a cop's abuse of power, reminding everyone that justice doesn't always wear a badge. His story spread, inspiring others to question authority when it oversteps and to demand respect where it's due. And for Rick, the encounter left a lasting impression, a reminder that true respect isn't commanded by a badge, but earned through actions. This story reminds us of the importance of standing up against abuse of power and treating others with respect, no matter the situation. Brian's calm courage shows that strength isn't about intimidation. It's about standing firm in what's right. What would you have done in Brian's place? Would you have stood your ground or handled it differently? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story and its message, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.